If you have your Bibles this morning, I'm going to invite you to turn to the very last chapter of the book of Mark. For those of you who have journeyed with us, we started back about September 8th going through the book of Mark. We called it Jesus 101. The great big letters that say Jesus 101 are down in the shed because it's Christmas. And so this is our very last Sunday in Jesus 101, and we are going to see Mark bring his book to a conclusion today, a book that he calls the Gospel, or the Good News about Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Last summer, I had the opportunity to go on vacation with my family to visit some relatives in the Twin Cities in Minnesota. It was awesome. Once all of the snow melted, we had a great time on vacation. It was great. The Twin Cities actually get into the 80s in summer, and my brother and sister-in-law, they took us to this water park. And when you walked to the water park, it was great. But you noticed that the water park was dominated by two of the biggest water slides that you've ever seen. I mean, they were just massive. And I looked at those things and I immediately said, not for me. You see, I am risk averse and I have some irrational fears, okay? One of my irrational fears about water slides is just that they're high and I don't want to do any heights, and they were massive. Number two, this is where you know I'm crazy. I'm always afraid that I'm going to slide off the side and fall to my death on the concrete. It occurs to me that might happen. So the water slide's not for me. And then third and finally, I'm always afraid I'm going to be that one guy who hits his head on the bottom of the slide, gets a concussion, and drowns while unconscious. So I didn't want to do the water slide that day. But as the day went on, you see these 8, 9, and 10-year-old kids going down these massive water slides. And then my brother and sister-in-law started appealing to my manhood. And I can't tell you what they said to me, but they called me some pretty mean names about not wanting to go down this awesome water slide, this water park that they wanted us to go to. And so they kind of, Matt, come on, Matt, you can do it. And so finally, I'm like, oh, right, this is terrible. So I climbed to the top of that water slide, and I'm terrified. I see all these kids who are 9 years old going down, and here's this 34-year-old man no. But I went down. I slid down. I did not fall off the side to my death, therefore I'm here. And I got to the bottom of that slide, and I went under the water for just a minute. I came back up, and I'll tell you what I did immediately. I got up, I got out of the water, I climbed back up to the top because it was awesome. Here I had thought that entire day, this water slide is not for me. It was for me. That water slide had been calling my name. And I thought to myself, all of these years where I could have been enjoying water slides, here I didn't die. It was awesome. It was a great experience. Absolutely loved it. But I just needed to accept that it was for me. As we complete the book of Mark today, we have two great tasks to do. Remember, we said way back in chapter 1 that Mark said that this is the good news, this is the gospel, and this chapter is going to complete the gospel. You can't have gospel without Mark chapter 16. The gospel will not be complete. And second, Mark is going to finally tell us who the gospel's for. And that's an interesting question. Who is the gospel for? You don't quite see Mark saying, this is why I wrote this book, and this is to whom I've written. He doesn't do that, but he tells us right here very plainly in chapter 16 who the gospel's for, and I want us to see that today. If you see it, it could change your life. Let's look at verse 16. We're going to be reading 1 through 8 of Mark chapter 16. Now, when the Sabbath was passed, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome brought spices that they might go and anoint the body of Jesus. If you were here last week, we studied that Jesus' death, according to Jesus' words in the book of Mark, is a ransom. Jesus died to get us out of a binding agreement with sin and death. He called his death a ransom for many, to take us out of this agreement that ends in our death. And he has died according to what he said the night before his death when he instituted the Lord's Supper, communion. He died as a new covenant for people. So Jesus, through his death, wanted to take people who were in this binding agreement with sin that always results in death and do something about that and bring us into a new binding agreement with God, a covenant with God by which we live. Verse 2, and very early on the first day of the week when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb where Jesus was laid. And they were saying to one another, who will roll away the stone from the entrance of the tomb? And looking up, they saw that the stone had been rolled back. It was very large. And entering the tomb, they saw a young man sitting on the right side, dressed in a white robe, and they were alarmed. And he said to them, don't be alarmed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. Now go, tell his disciples and Peter that he's going before you to Galilee, and there you will see him just as he told you. And they went out and fled from the tomb, for fear and trembling and astonishment had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Thus endeth the gospel. Now you say, well, that's not where my Bible ends. There's this weird thing. It's not in the rest of the book. I have something in brackets after verse 8, and I'm going to tell you why that is. They have put the rest of the book of Mark in brackets because scholars believe that it was probably not penned by the Apostle Mark. And here's why they don't believe that Mark wrote the rest of these words. Number one, the earliest manuscripts we have of the Bible, the very oldest copies of the Bible that have the book of Mark, don't include verses 9 and following. And when you decide what to bring to folks like us who want to read the words from the original Bible, the original words of the apostles and the associates of the apostles, we want to make sure that we're reading those words, and those aren't in the earliest copies, which makes us think, okay, well, this had to be added later on. The second thing that makes scholars believe that this isn't exactly what Mark did is that some of the older copies, okay, so newer to us, but older copies, don't have the same ending in Mark. They have varying endings, which sort of shows that the ending to Mark was in dispute. And then finally, the words after verse 9 don't seem to be written by the Apostle Mark because it adds vocabulary that he hasn't used in the rest of the book. So in essence, if I started speaking in Old English with these and thous, you would say, what is he doing? Well, in the same way as Greek scholars read the Bible from 9 and following, they go, what is Mark doing? That's not Mark. Why has it been included then in brackets? On the off chance that these could be the words of Mark, the scholars wanted to put them in there. But it's almost consensus that these are not original to Mark. They may be true statements about Jesus, true stories about Jesus, but they were probably added later. So we are reading the book of Mark, and therefore we're stopping in verse 8. You say, well, Pastor Matt, that seems like a pretty abrupt ending. They fled from the tomb terrified. Seems abrupt. Now you could see why if somebody wanted to add something about the rest of the story, they'd want to add it. Well, you can't have the gospel ending with people going, oh, I'm out of here. But that seems to be what happens here for the book of Mark. It's interesting, but I want to argue to you today that for Mark, the gospel's complete. Gospel's over. He's completed the story. He has given us the good news, and he's told us who it's for. And I'm going to make the case to you that that has taken place already in the book of Mark. Well, let's think about this story for just a minute. This is very matter of fact. That's why I love Mark. There's no fluff, no explanation. He just throws it out there to you. This is what happened. Very matter of fact. On a certain day after the Sabbath, of that year's Passover, they went to the tomb. They weren't allowed to go on the Sabbath. That would have been considered work. So these devoted women, and this is cool, we could preach a sermon just on this. These women were so devoted that they were going to go put spices on the body of Jesus 40 hours after his death. It's a grisly task. But as they're going there, they go, oh boy, how are we going to even get in there? That huge stone's in the way. So on a certain day, certain women, Mary, and Salome, went to a certain tomb, the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. It doesn't seem like a very mythological story. There's facts here that Mark is trying to just get across to us. This is what happened. This is who was there. And then they get freaked out because the stone is rolled away and creepy dude is sitting in the tomb. Just saying, this is the creepiest angel encounter of the entire Bible. There's someone sitting inside of the tomb. We'll get back to that in just a minute. And of course, he says, he is risen. He is risen. He's not here. He was crucified. He has risen. Go and tell the disciples and Peter. And they go, ooh, and they're out, right? Now, there's three things that we should sort of focus on here. First, he is risen. Let's not bury the lead. I mean, this is something that if true, is absolutely astounding. That by the own power that Jesus had within himself, on some level, he rose from the dead. Now, I don't know if you've ever seen anybody rise from the dead. You ever seen that? But this is what this angel has claimed has happened to these women. He says, Jesus is risen. He's going to go ahead of you into Galilee. Go tell the disciples to go, Peter. And that's the second. That's sort of odd. Because the last time we saw the disciples, what were they doing? They were abandoning Jesus. Remember, Jesus was being arrested, and they all ran away in fear? Really great friends, right? This reminds me of middle school, you know? You ever have that fight after middle school and the cop shows up and puts the kids in the back of the squad car just to freak them out? Everybody scatters, you know? That's what these guys do, but they're not scattering for the kids who are having a fight. They're scattering and running from their master, from Jesus, the one that they know best. They abandon him. And then to go one step further, he goes, go tell the disciples and Peter. What's the last thing we saw Peter doing? I don't know Jesus. I never knew Jesus. Don't let my Galilean accent fool you. I'm just here for the Passover. I don't know Jesus. He swears at the people. I don't know him. Great friends. Interesting that the angel says, go tell those guys who are cowering in an upper room. And of course, we might look at this and go, I can't imagine why these women are scared. They should be excited. Like we sing, on the third at break of dawn, and all the hands go up, we begin to, but these women had no context for the resurrection. They didn't have like 2,000 years of Jesus is risen. He is risen indeed. They had none of that. They just, imagine, let's just back up for just a minute. Let's think of this happened to you. We'll try to equate something. You go to the grave of a loved one, right? When you get there, you notice that the grave has been dug up. I mean, you'd be horrified just at that moment. They see the stone rolled away. What? Why is the stone rolled away? You would say, why is the tomb? So you walk up to the tomb, you look down, the casket and the vault are missing, but there's a dude in white sitting in the hole. You going to stick around? And what if the dude in white told you something so stupid and so astounding, like, yes, the body of your loved one was abducted by aliens? You would run and you would call the cops immediately. You would not stick around. You'd not be like, what are you doing in my loved one's grave? None of that. In fact, we find out from the book of John, Mary left. She ran away. She sees the gardener. She's like, you stole his body, didn't you? It wasn't the gardener. But anyhow, that's the fear and amazement and the trembling. They have no context for the resurrection. Just as we would think, abducted by aliens, bull. They're thinking, risen, he's dead. Now, we have 2,000 years in the entire book of Mark to give us more context, don't we? In fact, Jesus did say it to his disciples. He did let them know, but once again, nobody's ever risen from the dead, so why would you not take that to be figurative? Yeah, I'm going to die, but I'm going to rise from the dead. If Jesus had said that to me, I'd look at him and go, yeah, I could see, like, people reject you, people won't like you, that'll be like your death, but then people will like you again, you'll become the Messiah, you'll become a king, you'll rise from the dead. I get it, Jesus. No, Jesus died. The angel says he was crucified. So everything that they think about Jesus has already been shattered. So why would they look at why would they be in that tomb that day and go, yes, he is risen indeed. Let's sing a praise song. No, they get out of there as quickly as possible. Now, Jesus has prepped us for this. 2,000 years, we've been told Jesus is risen, but he said it all over the book of Mark. Mark 8:31, I will die, I will rise. Mark 9:9, after I've risen. Mark 9:21, I will rise. Mark 10:34, I will rise. Mark 14:28, after I've risen. So Jesus, throughout the gospel, has said something consistently. It's the very center of the gospel. I will die, and I will rise. He has to. We explained last week why he had to die. He had to die because you and I are in a binding agreement with sin and death. Our lives are marked by the potholes of sin. People do cruddy things to us, and we do cruddy things to people. And just when we think we're becoming the person that I need to be, we go and do cruddy things again. Lives marked by crud, sin. But also, all of us have a date with death. And we think to ourselves, it ought not be this way. Jesus said, I have come to ransom you from sin and death, Mark 10:45. I have come to do that. And then he says in Mark 14:21 and 22, I am going to bring you into a new covenant with God. I'm going to rescue you from sin and death. We talked about this last week. And I have such a powerful new agreement for you to live in that sin and death will no longer hold you. You are ransomed for God in covenant with me. And every time we take communion, we celebrate that. But the good news is not complete until Jesus rises. And that's why he says, I will die and I will rise. Resurrection must happen. Now, why is that? Why does Jesus have to rise? And this is incredibly important if we complete the gospel. And to sort of get a background for this, I want us to go to the other place it talks about resurrection in the book of Mark. So if you have your Bibles, turn back a couple of pages to Mark chapter 12. Jesus gets into a strong dispute with the Sadducees. They're the priestly class, the ones who run the temple. In fact, this is one of the only times in the Bible where Jesus is just pretty much just going, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong. And it's about resurrection. Look at verse 18 of chapter 12. It says, and the Sadducees came to him who say there is no resurrection. Let's just stop right there before we go any further. The Sadducees came to him and said there is no resurrection. So they're going to come to Jesus and they're going to ask Jesus a ridiculous question. And if you want to go back and read the rest of chapter 12 of Mark, you're welcome to do it. They're going to ask Jesus a ridiculous question to try to explain to Jesus, there is no resurrection. When we're dead, we're dead. Many scholars believe that the Sadducees were annihilationists. They just said, when you're dead, and that's it. And you'd say, well, why did God give us the law? They'd say, God gave us the law so we'd follow him in this life, and then we'd just be gone. They had no concept of the afterlife, that God has anything good in store for us. Therefore, they were sad, you see. You're welcome. You're welcome. Yeah, came up with that on my own. Not true. Not true. Every seminary class ever tells that joke, and it never gets any better. But anyhow, had no hope, these guys. No hope at all. So these guys are not even like so many religions of the world that it's like, God will one day enlighten my spirit, and I will go play a harp on a cloud, and my spirit will leave this horrible broken body, and I will go off and play a harp. Not even like that. Resurrection is one step further. Resurrection says, the idea of resurrection is this: not only will God do something about your spirit, but God is going to do something about all of you. Like he's going to fix your flesh as well. And you're like, I thought doctors did that. No, they just slow your decay. The truth, why are you laughing so hard, Lowell? Man, I heard you all the way over there. You decaying as we speak? Anyhow, I'm sorry, second service. I say things in second service to Lowell that I would never say in first service, but it's more laid back here. Anyhow, that's what's going on in our bodies, right? We're decaying on some level. And from the time of the Garden of Eden until now, human beings have had this date with death. Our bodies decay. Resurrection says that God is not only going to redeem and rescue our spirits, he's going to rescue our bodies as well. And this is where Jesus argues with them. Look at verse 24. Jesus is getting all upset at them. He says, is this not the reason that you're wrong? That you Sadducees neither know the scriptures nor the power of God, for when they rise from the dead. Jesus is just laying it out for these Sadducees. He's saying, you're dead wrong. At the end of this section, he goes, God's not the God of the dead, he's the God of the living. God is life itself. If it ends in death, you guys have totally missed out on who God is. And of course, I mean, the scriptures are replete with this idea that after death, we're going to see God. Pastor Otto read us one of the multiple Psalms this morning about God and us having this forever relationship. But perhaps one of the best passages on resurrection comes from the book of Job. Job says, after my flesh has been destroyed, meaning after I'm dead, I'm going to stand on the earth and see God with my own eyes. What? After I'm dead, I'm going to stand on the earth and see God with my own eyes. Job had resurrection on the brain. He gave God full credit. So the scriptures point to forever. They point to this idea that God's going to redeem all of us, and that's why Jesus says, you don't even know the power of God. To think that God would start this earth only to annihilate you, you're missing it. And even so, for those who would say God's started this earth, but he's only going to save your spirit, your soul, and you're going to play a harp on a cloud just like Looney Tunes said we would, if that is that what's going to happen? You remember Yosemite Sam? He'd get blown up by Bugs Bunny. Anyhow, so long story short, not good theology. What he is saying is you're giving God no credit. You don't know the power of God. That God would only save your spirit? No. God is going to fix, redeem, restore all of you. That's resurrection. That's resurrection. That's what I want. I don't want to cease to be human. I don't want to become a spirit floating around in heaven in a wispy state. I want to be the type of person that I was designed to be, made in God's image without a binding agreement with sin and death. I want to be in a body that doesn't decay and see what that feels like. You're like, that sounds pretty good. I could go for that. That's the promise of resurrection. And the proof that this is on the way took place in the tomb that day. Jesus rose from the dead to give us hope that that would be the case for all of us, to prove that it could be done, to prove that we could overcome sin and death, that there would be no sting in death, that death is not the end, and that a body that has been destroyed can be remade and renewed. We talked about what happened to the body of Jesus last week, didn't we? He was flayed alive, yet God gave him a resurrected body that would last forever. You say, how did Jesus rise from the dead? Well, we've explained it throughout the book of Mark. It's very simple. If you're in a binding agreement with sin and death, you die. That's us. But what if you never enter agreement with sin and death? What if you chose what Adam and Eve did not, which is to trust and obey God fully instead of pursuing your own destiny? It would seem to me that you would never enter in to a covenant with sin and death. And therefore, when someone took your life, you could not stay dead. And that's exactly what happened with Jesus. He chose the tree of life. He didn't choose the knowledge of good and evil. He didn't choose to see what was the opposite of God. He knew that God his Father was life, and in him was life. And to choose the other side of the coin would only lead to death. But Jesus never chose that. He did what we were given opportunity to in the garden, is that he trusted God completely, obeyed him with his everything. And therefore, he did not need to be released from sin and death. He could overcome sin and death on his own volition. You say, that I get it, Matt. Theologically, that makes sense. Thank you for telling me why Jesus rose from the dead. But why should that give me hope? Because of what we learned last week. You're no longer in a binding agreement with sin and death either. Through the blood of Jesus, you are no longer in an agreement with sin and death. You are in agreement with life himself. You are in covenant relationship with the God who created you for life. He is not the God of the dead. He is the God of the living. And he has pursued a goal, which is to bring you out of sin and death into life, you and me. He's done that. The gospel is only complete when God saves all of us. And he's going to do that through resurrection, and he did that through the resurrection of Jesus Christ, his son. That's why Peter said in 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 3, "Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who in his great mercy has given us new birth into a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus from the dead." He's saying our hope is built on nothing except that Jesus has risen from the dead. And if we're in agreement with Jesus, we will be raised also. That is what Peter's saying. He is our living hope. When Jesus defeats sin and death, when Jesus proves that he never chose the other side of the coin, when Jesus shows that there is no sting in death and there can be resurrection for you, if he's pulled you into the same agreement that he's in with God, you won't stay dead either. That's the power of resurrection. And that's why Jesus had to rise from the dead, to be our living hope, that we would also, not constrained by sin and death, but in an agreement with life himself, our Creator God. You say, who's it for? That was the other question. You said, that completes the gospel. Jesus' resurrection completes the gospel. It's proof positive that death is not the end. But who's it for? Well, Mark's told us. It's for the disciples and Peter. Go tell the disciples and Peter, I'm risen. I'll go ahead of you into Galilee. But where have we left those guys? Last we saw them, the disciples were abandoning God. And Peter was denying he ever knew him. The gospel is for the disciples and Peter. You see, throughout this thread of the book of Mark, we have watched in Jesus 101 as we have seen event after event, teaching after teaching unfold that has showed us the goodness and the mercy and the wonder and the awe of who Jesus is. But there has been this subtext, this sub-narrative that could almost be called Humans 101. The disciples represent us. Most of the time, they're confused. Most of the time, they're lacking in faith. Most of the time, they're looking at Jesus going, you can't do that. There's even moments where they look at Jesus and rebuke him. Say, Jesus, you can't be doing that. And they see Jesus do these miraculous things. In the very next chapter, they're going, I don't trust him. They think that they are going to leverage Jesus into becoming men of power. That's the disciples. They claim to serve God, but so often they fail God. And the last picture that we see before the cross and the resurrection of Jesus is them abandoning him completely and renouncing him as if they never knew him. But the gospel is for them. When I read the book of Mark and I see the disciples, I see myself. Someone who is often confused, someone who can lack faith, someone who can fail even when I claim to be serving God, someone who could ignore the voice of God in my life, someone who can see God do miraculous things and then turn around the very next day and not trust him. I see myself. And I recognize that the gospel is for even me. For even me. Go tell the disciples and Peter. He might as well be saying to you, go tell Tom. Go tell Rochelle. Go tell Mark. Go tell John. He is risen. Go tell Matthew. He is risen. You no longer need to live how you lived. You get to be born again into a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ. It's even for you. And I don't know where you're at today. You might feel that things are just peachy keen between you and God. But I see myself in the face of his disciples. And I also see myself in the hope of his disciples. Because once they fully grasped who Jesus was and what he'd done, once Peter knew that he had new birth into a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus, once he knew, it changed him. And if it wasn't for those failing, abandoning, renouncing disciples, none of us would be here today. They took this good news of he is risen to the world. Their story is one that reminds us that through the power of the gospel, we can be changed. And we can make an impact for God. And in his great mercy, wherever you stand with God today, the gospel is for you. For you. For you. Thus endeth the good news.